Spotlight. I'm Stephanie Shea, and I'm very happy to be back with you after a very long hiatus, a forced hiatus, I should say, because due to my voice issues. For those who have been following me on social media, you will know that I've been dealing with some problems. I'm starting voice therapy, so all of those issues will be taken care of. I just hope today that my voice isn't too raspy and it's not too distracting. So enough with the housekeeping there. My guest today is Dr. Randall Hall. Welcome, Randall.
Thanks.
If you'll allow me to give a brief introduction, Randall Hall is a professor of music at Augustana College in Rock Island, Illinois, as well as a performing saxophonist and composer. Randall, you and I are acquainted with each other through my aunt, Dr. Patricia Shea, who used to be your colleague before she retired, and I'm so happy that you reached out to me to talk about your work. So that's what we're going to do today.
Well, it's great to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to chat.
Well, I'm sure it's going to be a very interesting discussion today. Well, I'll probably be listening more than I'll be talking. But at the moment, you're writing a book about speculative music. I'm going to put quotation marks around that, and or weird music, and how this relates to the sacred and ritual or initiatory experiences. Before we get into all of that, though, I'd like to ask you if you could talk a little bit first about your own background and your inspiration for thinking about this type of music and for researching this particular area.
Right. My interests tend to be that they always require a lot of explanation before you can even start having the conversation. But I got started in music, coming up, playing in the school band through junior high and high school. Got the bug, decided to go to college to continue studying music. And I'm a saxophonist, and so my trajectory started out like most saxophonists. I was immediately channeled into the jazz band and playing jazz, and I enjoyed doing that quite a bit. But then later I started to discover the world of classical music, and so that became another interest. There is a sort of very small world of concert saxophone. So there's that. And so in college, one thing I got into kind of moving out of my jazz experience was I got heavy into free improvisation, and that starts to blur some of the musical boundaries. Is it jazz? Is it experimental music? It's kind of all of those things. And the idea of free improvisation is that you're just improvising. You get together with people and you just start playing. You're not playing a tune. You're not working with an organized structure. You just start playing. And that was something I really enjoyed doing. And so I think, that was the beginning of my initiation into weird music. So weird is a problematic term, but it's maybe a little more catchy than some of the more typical names: experimental, avant-garde, contemporary. Later, I went to study a lot of this, quote, weird repertoire in France, and there we simply referred to it as musique contemporaine, contemporary music. And so I came into weird music just as a sort of stylistic evolution. I was starting to listen to 20th century classical music, which gets quite avant-garde. I was doing this free improvisation. In my saxophone studies, I was starting to learn some of this more experimental repertoire, which requires new playing techniques, extended playing techniques. And I think of that as any sound you can make with an instrument other than the one it was invented to do. So, for example, if the piano is designed to play pitches on the keys, when you start plucking the strings or hitting the side, that would be an extended technique. So suddenly there was a big sound world that opened up on saxophone. I was playing multiphonics, the production of multiple sounds simultaneously, slap tongue, which is a percussive technique, key clicks, microtones, growls, all of these kind of crazy sounds, which I really enjoyed. And so I started to pursue that very vigorously in my music studies. And that kind of remains my specialization as a performer now. And so while I was in college discovering this stuff was sort of my first introduction to speculative music. And I think it would take some years after to figure out there was a name for it. But I had always been sort of interested in religion and mythology and symbols and ritual. And, as a young guy in a sort of undefined way, just sort of a vague notion of these things. But I was sitting in my music history class in college, and the teacher started talking about the harmony of the spheres. And it was like someone had put a spell on me. I didn't quite understand what she was talking about, but something caught my imagination, and I was like, ooh. So the harmony of the spheres, it goes back to the sort of pre-modern scientific understanding of our heliocentric cosmos. This is the ancient geocentric model. And so the Earth is at the center, and then the 7 planets of the ancient world, the Sun, the Moon, Mercury, Mars, Venus, Jupiter, Saturn, I think that's all of them. Those all rotate around the Earth, and they generate a sound. So the cosmos is making this musical sound that is sort of the sound of a divinely ordered cosmos. And I just thought, what is that? That is cool. And then I immediately, being a music student, was like, okay, well, how do I play that? What is that going to sound like? And I didn't realize that was the question back at that early moment. And so it would take, sort of in fits and starts over the years, sort of dabbling in reading more about the harmony of the spheres, and then kind of getting overwhelmed and abandoning the project now and then. But the idea of speculative music and where the name comes from, well, it kind of has multiple facets. We think of speculation in modern English carries a couple different connotations. On the one hand, when you're speculating, you're just making stuff up. So it kind of carries that more derogatory sense. But also speculation is contemplation, deep thinking about things, usually about sacred or spiritual things. And the name comes back to musica speculativa, is the idea a speculum is a type of mirror. And so the idea is that music is a mirror that's held up to the cosmos to reflect that divine order. And, the farther I got in this stuff, just the more I was hooked on it. So how did I get into writing this book? Well, which is still in process, although approaching the finish line. So speculative music is just a different way about looking at how we make music. For most people, when we think about making music, we have some idea of self-expression or expressing an emotion, a shared feeling. And we all know, the importance of the breakup song when we're young, and I pint a gallon of ice cream. And that song speaks to that experience, shared human experience. And in that sense, music becomes a kind of rhetoric. It is a way of persuading the listener to feel a certain thing. So if I write a breakup song, I'm persuading the listener to identify with or relive those moments. If I write a happy song, I'm trying to elevate their muse. And so it's dealing a lot with our feelings. That's a fairly recent way of looking at music. That sort of originates in the Renaissance and the early modern period. So the 16th and 17th century. And we kind of take that for granted because for the last several hundred years, that's how we've been experiencing music. And that's a perfectly fine way to experience music. But I think speculative music is not dealing with emotional expression as much as it's dealing with a sort of symbolic participation. It is in this reflecting of the cosmos, of a divinely ordered cosmos. It is, I think, less, I mean, listening to speculative music or engaging with speculative music can be an emotional, expressive thing. So I don't mean to say that it's the sterile sort of thing, but it is, I think, designed to be more than just making you feel something. It's designed to make you participate in, I guess we could say, a higher plane of being. I like to use the writer Ananda Kumar Swami, who writes a lot about this kind of stuff. Uses defines a symbol as a representation on one level of existence of something on a higher level of existence. And so if we look at symbols that way, then the speculative music is trying to engage the listener, well, at that higher ontological level. So I wanted to kind of get that on the table. What is this speculative music thing? And then and show it as a way of experiencing music, making music, distinct from our regular models of music making. Now, for me, as a guy who was pretty committed to weird music, this presented some challenges. The historical study of speculative music is a little bit, murky. It gets tricky pretty quick. And one of the reasons for that is that a lot of mainstream musicologists just aren't interested in it. Speculative music. Okay, so there's always been a tension between speculative music and practical music, making music and thinking about music. And when we say thinking about music, what do we mean? Do we just mean people who do music theory and are thinking about musical structures, which is kind of how most modern people think of speculative music? Or are we thinking about speculation in this more symbolic way? And a lot of musicologists who, well, first off, not a lot of people are writing about it. When I started working on this project, I went to all the normal music reference, academic reference books, and you can't just look up speculative music and find a definition. It's sort of buried in there, if you can find it at all. The Grove's Dictionary of Music and Musicians, which is about, in the print edition, is something like 25 volumes. It doesn't have a separate entry on it. In the article on musicology, you can find a reference. And they sort of refer to it as music theory, just thinking about musical structures. And they make a very passing statement about how speculative concerns moved into fringe esoteric movements. End of statement. So we see speculative music kind of going the way of your main theme of rejected knowledge. It just is not part of the agenda anymore. So then in that void, we find a lot of just weird stuff on the internet, filling in for that. And you get all kinds of overstated and, superficial and restated, people are clearly cutting and pasting from other websites and so on and so forth. So it was kind of tricky to get into this. So I've kind of come to think of speculative music. You can approach it three ways. And you can approach it historically and try to figure out what people in the past really thought about this. You can invent it, you just make stuff up, which is how a lot of the internet deals with it. And you can be aspirational. And I think a lot of the more sort of pop or non-academic ideas about speculative music, about using sound as part of a contemplative practice, are not necessarily bad ideas. I mean, they're suggesting ways that sound can be engaged with. But they're just not history. So it's fine to aspire to use sound a certain way, but we don't need to pretend it's historical. And so my objections with some of what you read on the internet is maybe less about practice and more just about being bad history. So I have tried to be mindful of that, of what actually happened. So I think it might make, to understand why weird music is disadvantaged, it might make a little sense to maybe just go through some of the more historical elements.
Very good.
So this goes back, I mean, some sources say it goes all the way back to the beginning of civilization with the Sumerians. That's a little bit past my, outside of my pay grade. But by the time of the Greeks, it's part of the sort of Pythagorean-Platonic tradition. And there's a lot of debate about how I mean, we normally describe Plato as influenced by Pythagoras, but it's unclear how much did he actually know, how much did he just use Pythagoras as his own mouthpiece, right? So it's a big muddle, and I'm not the guy who's going to untangle those threads. But the gist of it is, Plato gives us the image of the harmony of the spheres in the Republic at the very end. And most people will be familiar with reading The Cave and so on and so forth. So this comes after The Cave. And it's interesting because after we leave The Cave and we ascend to the sunlit world, if we keep going through the rest of the Republic, we eventually get this story about he's a warrior and he's killed in battle. And days later, they get his body. They're getting the funeral ready. They've got him on the pyre ready to burn him. And he wakes up and he's had essentially an out of body experience. And during this time, he has journeyed into the afterlife, and he goes to this meadow and he sees sort of not really tunnels, but openings above and below, and souls have gone down to be punished or have experienced reward. Then they all go to the meadow to hang out for a while before their next incarnation. And then at a certain point, they start walking to where or floating, I guess. They start moving towards where they're going to enter the world again, and they see the cosmos. And it is a sort of series of disks with the different planets going around the Earth. In Plato's version, it's suspended by the spindle of necessity, which I can't say that I understand exactly what that means. But they hear this great song of the cosmos, and it is, there's a muse or siren, there's a siren on each of the planets, and then the daughters of necessity, which are I think they work out to be past, present, future, something like that. They're all singing this great concord of the cosmos, and it's this beautiful thing, and then that's kind of all that you get. So it's really sort of a beatific vision of just the beauty of the cosmos. Okay, so we have that. Well, that's beautiful, but okay, so what does that mean? Well, in another passage, in the Timaeus, Plato is giving his account of the creation, his creation myth. And in essence, the demiurge or the craft worker is creating the world according to musical principles. And this is where the sort of music and math stuff comes in. The account gets a little bit dense, and it's a good example of why it's much better to work with a mathematical formula than writing out mathematical formulas, because Plato says them in prose and they're just awful to read. It's much easier in math symbols. But basically, he's generating a series of numbers through the powers of 2 and 3, and then he does some harmonic means and arithmetic means and goes through all this. The long and short of it is he creates a big bunch of numbers. And then as he sorts through those numbers, he starts to show us that they boil down to the harmonic ratios. And so, so what are the harmonic ratios? A lot of listeners will have heard, with or without explanation, that music is math. And this is what they're talking about. So I'll just try to explain this quickly. So any two musical intervals can be defined by a proportion. And that proportion in our modern understanding is understood as a proportion between the vibration, the frequency of vibration between the two pitches, or as the ancients would do it, through string lengths. So if anybody plays guitar, if you press any string exactly halfway, you're going to produce the octave, and we can measure all the other intervals by similar proportions. So talking about music is usually not as good as hearing it. So if we take any note, are we hearing that okay? Yeah. Okay. So we have, that's just a D note. I have a very, very small keyboard, so we'll have to keep things compact. So if I play the octave, and most people will hear that as a consonance, as something that's stable in sounding together. That is defined as a 2-to-1 ratio. If we were to pluck a D string halfway, we would go up the octave. If we, I don't know what the frequency is but this one is twice as much as this one, right? So we've got this 2-to-1 relationship. Now, if I'm going to condense this down because of my small keyboard, but if we were to do a 2-to-3 ratio, we would get that, a D to an A, a perfect fifth, right? And then we can create the perfect fourth with a 4-to-3 ratio. Right. And what's interesting is if I take my fifth and I go from the A to the D, that's a perfect fourth. So this sound contains the relationships of 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. Right? Or I could go the other way. I could go down a fifth, then down a fourth. And so we sort of have the mirror image of that. So we call those, to this day, perfect intervals. And I think a lot of music theory students don't bother to think about where they come from. We have other consonant intervals. For example, we have major thirds and minor thirds. They come in 2 different flavors, but perfect intervals only come in perfect. Okay, yes, you can make them diminished and augmented, but normally as consonants they are perfect. And the reason they're still called perfect goes back to this Pythagorean idea that number is the essence of the cosmos, and the perfect expression of that is through simple whole numbers. And so if we think about this sound as 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, well, the Pythagoreans had a symbol called the tetractys, I think. Greek. Anybody speaking Greek is free to correct me, which is a symbol. It's a triangle made with 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots, 4 dots. And within that little symbol is all of the perfect intervals. In fact, it was, we take for granted that sound of the major triad, but it wasn't until well into the Middle Ages that this interval was accepted as a consonance. And it wasn't because it was unbeautiful. It was because it didn't correspond to the simple whole number ratios. The ratio for the major third is a bit more complex. And so for a long time, thirds were not acceptable. Even late in the Middle Ages, when you write polyphony, when you're putting multiple parts together, a cadence, the conclusion of a passage, should end on a perfect interval. You shouldn't end that's imperfect. So it's that sort of symbolic connection between number and sound and cosmos happening. And so, Plato goes in and says that these perfect intervals are the key, and then he fills them in with little pieces, little notes, and you get the sort of the tetrachords used in Greek music, which is a totally different system. But what's interesting in Plato's Timaeus account is the way that the cosmos is made is, the way I read it is the demiurge is taking elements of the intelligible realm, things that are essentially the area of the forms, things that are beyond matter. And he's taking material things, and he's taking the soul as the median between sort of the noetic ideal and the physical, and he's rolling them all out. They describe rolling out. You can imagine kids making with their Play-Doh, rolling out these long things and braiding them together, and then using these numbers, the musical numbers, to mark off where how he's going to break those off and make the different elements of reality, which is a really beautiful creation account, because basically the eternal is woven into the temporal, and it's all interconnected. The divine order is built into the physical cosmos through number, musical number. And so the idea is, as you make music that uses these numbers, you recreate a connection. You make that mirror. You're reflecting that order. And there's a great quote by Cicero later in his commentary on the Republic, that he tells a story of an out-of-body experience. He meets his deceased grandfather. He ascends into the spheres, and he says to his grandfather, "What is this great and pleasing sound?" And his grandfather, who's already in the next dimension, says, "Don't you know this is the harmony of the spheres? This is the sound of the cosmos." And he goes on to say that gifted people through song and stringed instruments have created a return to that dimension, much as those who study sacred teachings do. And so there is this anagogic idea built into it that music through the numbers will elevate the soul. And it was, the more you find out about this, I was getting hooked. So that's kind of the traditional reading of speculative music. This is in play through ancient Greece. It's in play through the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance. Now, when I say in play, philosophers and theologians are spending a fair amount of time thinking about this. Musicians are tending to say, yeah, there's a speculative thing. Now let's make some music. If you think about a college music department, that's kind of the way it goes. A lot of students do what they dutifully take their theory class, and then they, get to rehearsal. Other students are more interested in this stuff. And I've really, my research has really gone into the Greece and then into the medieval Renaissance tradition. But if one were to look into Judaism and Islam, you're going to have all kinds of rich material on this also. And this was an idea that kept popping up in Indian philosophy and theology, which I find really fascinating. But at a certain point, one must know their limits, and Indian stuff is so vast and complicated. But, if we think of the use of mantras, if we think of ideas like Om, all of this stuff is within that speculative idea. So it focus on consonances, on perfect intervals, right, has led many to conclude that modern music is ineligible for consideration as speculative music. And so if we think of composers like Schoenberg or Webern in the early 20th century, some of the old rules about consonance and dissonance broke down. So if we define a consonance as a group of notes that are considered stable and at rest, a dissonance would be a group that are unstable, requiring resolution to a consonant. So here's a traditional dissonance, which would then be resolved to a consonance. Okay, so around the 20th century, there's a long progression through the 19th century, which we probably don't need to get into, but the summary is that we started to hear sounds like this. And people say, well, that is just not appropriate for speculative music. It's a discord, yada yada yada. So we're not gonna traffic in that. So that's sort of the conventional wisdom on speculative music. If you're going to attempt to hear speculative music or make speculative music, then you really need to stick to maybe medieval music, Gregorian chant, early polyphony, at the, I guess we can put Bach in there, but it needs to be, quote, pretty music. And this gets finally the long way around to the second part of the book. If speculative music is a thing, I find that conclusion that contemporary music or weird music is antithetical to speculative music to be faulty. And so the sort of part of my second goal is a sort of apology for weird music and how not only is it eligible to be speculative, but in some ways it fulfills speculative goals, I think, better, right? And one of the things that got me as I was working through this, one of the problems is people don't make very systematic discussions about this, so you kind of have to piece it together. But sort of the gist or the vibe of it is that early music is the best speculative music. So music before about 1600. Music from 1900 forward is just not speculative. This is the ugly rationalist industrial music that silenced the harmony of the spheres. But if we do a little calculations, that leaves us with a 200-year period not accounted for. And that's a significant period in music between 17 and 1900. That is the most famous classical music, the Baroque classical and Romantic eras. So any of the household names from Bach to Mozart to Beethoven. What do we do with these guys? And we need to take account of them. And a lot of sources kind of seem to not really respond to that. People don't engage that question. And it seems to be if your goal is to say that weird music should be excluded, then that mainstream classical romantic period is kind of accepted. But if you actually look at the internal logic of the argument for speculative music as a symbolic participation, not an emotional expression, then those musics cannot be included. And it has to do with the question of what is modernity? What does it mean to be modern? And we use casually modern to refer to the 20th century, and that makes sense because of all of the technological developments and so forth. But the early modern period is usually tracked in the 1600s, and so that is sort of the watershed moment in history, which a lot of it is attributed to the rise of science, right? So there's a new worldview, and distinct from the earlier sort of mythopoetic worldview, traditional worldview, however you want to refer to it. And it is, okay, so none of these things happen overnight, but I think if you start tracing around 1500s-ish, going into the main part of the Renaissance, we start to see composers move from a more sort of symbolic or architectural approach to their music to a more progressively towards a more modern, expressive one. An example that might be a little esoteric for listeners, but we'll go with it anyway. If we look at the early Renaissance composer Guillaume Dufay, who's still writing in a somewhat medieval style. I'm thinking of in his Missa l'homme armé, Mass of the Armed Man, he's using a cantus firmus structure, which is very, you use a pre-existing tune as a scaffolding, you add parts. He doesn't care about text setting. You just sort of throw the words on wherever. It tends to have more open perfect intervals, so more of that than, it's a little more, Dufay is starting to use imperfect consonances, but it's just, to modern ears, it sounds a little older. Whereas Jacques-Antoine, who is just a generation after, is starting to really think about the alignment of text and music, about matching musical phrases to grammatical phrases in the music. So he's starting to take a lot of care in text setting. And pieces like his Ave Maria Virgo Serena is starting to become more emotional. And this is a piece, it's a a sacred poem to the Virgin Mary, and there's a beautiful moment at the end of the piece. The last lines are Mater Dei memento mei, Mother of God, remember me. And he's had this beautiful florid imitative counterpoint, and it's floating this really wonderful piece. And then at the very last moment, he adds on to this poem, this Mother of God, remember me. And he sets it very homophonically. All the voices move together very quietly as though it's his direct personal prayer. And this may be urban legend, but the word on the street is that was the piece he wanted to hear on his deathbed. So we can imagine this it's a very emotional moment. It's not an abstract symbolic moment. It is a personal moment. And I think those two pieces start to show this shift from this older speculative thing to a more modern expression. And if we follow the Renaissance, for fans of madrigals, this is the period where they're getting going after Josquin, and just a lot of attention to text setting to highlight the emotional feeling of the text. Now, it wasn't like on 1600 January 1st, the Composers Guild got up and at their New Year's breakfast said, now we're going to be expressive. I mean, there's a long couple hundred years transition here. But by the 1600s, it's this idea of emotions is it's solidified enough that no less than René Descartes will write a little book on music, and he says, I don't care about your speculation. I don't care about your sort of different musical modes influencing. It's purely stimulus and psychological response, right? You hear things and you have a feeling based on your cultural codes with that. And if we, I think Descartes is, it's interesting that he was dealing with music also, because he seems to represent that shift from sort of pre-modern world to the modern world. So as so many earlier esoteric or occult sciences are being pushed aside as rejected knowledge, speculative music is really moving out also. So because music from 1600 or even before 1600, but by the 1600s, this is really pretty established. In the Baroque period, we're dealing with the doctrine of the affections. The way affections are simply emotional states. And and there are treatises written on how the composers can use rhetoric as a model to influence emotional states. So we're not thinking about symbols anymore. We're not dealing with that earlier symbolic view. It's a pretty modern view of music. So the end of speculative music really lines up with so many things in the esoteric as it's around 1600 with the birth of the modern world. So the change from traditional musical techniques to more radical musical techniques in 1900 is simply a technical thing. A lot of the goals of composers in the 20th century who write some radical music is the same as it had been for hundreds of years. They're simply being expressive, except that the traditional narrative of modern art or modernist art in the 20th century is that this represents this new hyper-rational, positivistic kind of thinking. And if you actually look at a lot of the movements, and there's a lot of work in art history now too, many of these artists are actually concerned with restoring a sort of spiritual element in art. And, Vasily Kandinsky, who was an early abstract painter, and he writes a little book concerning the spiritual in art. And he's talking about how this more abstract image making is actually trying to look past the surface of things. And he incidentally was a pal for a while of Arnold Schoenberg, who is usually considered the great, Satan of this whole thing. And, Schoenberg, I'm convinced, was maybe not a formal esotericist, but he was interested in spiritual things. And so his radically different music was trying to push you past just regular perception. So And there's some more technical details with the music. We use in our modern system of tuning, we use a system called equal temperament, where we divide the octave exactly in half. It is acoustically pure, but then every other note in the octave is slightly flat. It's slightly out of tune. We don't use pure Pythagorean tuning. So those harmonic ratios in our modern system have been compromised. And there's, some of the musical techniques that grew up in the 17th and 18th century, for example, modulation, the ability to change keys, become very difficult to do when using Pythagorean tuning with pure ratios.
Oh, okay.
So you really tend to tune a keyboard to be in a key. And then as you modulate it, distantly related keys that become really, by modern standards, out of tune. And so eventually the solution was to distribute the out of tuneness. Okay, there's a lot of complicated math here, which we'll do very quickly, but to distribute the out of tuneness between everything. So most people find the tuning of the modern piano to be pleasing. It facilitates these different techniques. But what I wonder, based on what we said on Timaeus, if essentially God has tuned the cosmos one way, and we make music that matches that to elevate our souls, then how can we retune for aesthetic reasons and still claim the same the same sort of powerful effect of number alignment? It just doesn't add up. And in practical terms, that's fine, because by the time we used that system, we weren't trying to return the soul.
Right.
So, but I think that really shows a shift from in music theorists struggled with this for thousands of years. The Greeks knew about these problems, and people have been messing with it. But one of the problems they didn't move forward with the equal temperament solution is that people realized it messed up the whole Pythagorean number symbolism. So by the early modern era, people don't care so much. So that's the beginning of modern music. And the other thing that made me wonder about this is, okay, so on the one hand, if we imagine using these very consonant musics to elevate the soul through the ascend through the harmony of spheres, this is a beautiful image of ascent, and we might identify that with Apollo and the sun and these radiant images. But if we actually look at traditional symbols, they're not always like that. In fact, they're the opposite, and there seems to be sort of a dark and a chthonic and kind of scary set of symbols. And I'm thinking of all, Ezekiel's visions of the wheel, and you have these creatures with four faces, and you have a chariot with eyes all over it that moves in all directions at once, and there's lightning and all of this crazy stuff. And I'm like, this is not the vision of glorious Apollo. There's something else going on here, and I think we can multiply those images really, really quickly. And along, on the way working on this stuff, I got into the Neoplatonist, and you have people like Porphyry, who writes his little essay on the Cave of the Nymphs, and he's trying to explain this passage in Homer. And he basically says, when you see something weird, that's your signal that you need to do some hermeneutical digging, because that's where that's what you want to unpack. It's the strange that is the indicator of a higher meaning, not the stuff that is beautiful, radiant Apollo.
Interesting.
A lot. I hope so, because I hang a lot on that idea. Yeah. But if you think about some of the more traditionalist writers like Guénon and Chuan and even Kumaraswamy. Kumaraswamy is a writer I really enjoy, and he really makes the argument for a speculative art, I think, very effectively. But then he turns around and says, yeah, but anything in the 20th century is garbage. It just, we've completely lost it. And it's like, But he spends a long time talking about how in traditional iconography, images are always abstracted. The figure is always stylized. And he says in all cultures from India to Japan to Europe, to the Americas, will be not a biologically accurate depiction of a figure, but it will be stylized in some way. And it's a reminder that you're not looking at a person, you're looking at something that represents something on a higher level. Yeah. So if we, by analogy, if we take that to music, if we listen to music that well, that seems familiar. You think about your favorite pop music, your favorite folk music, or even familiar classical pieces. There's something, when we engage those, we have feelings about what? Ourselves or our friends, or people like us. We're staying in our regular frame of reference, or maybe deepening our experience of that reference, but we're still in our frame of reference. When we hear, if we take Porphyry seriously, if we read something that's weird and bizarre, that tells us to look deeper. Well, why not if we hear something that seems weird or bizarre? Maybe that's the marker that something different is happening. And we're familiar with this trope in the movies, right? If we watch Twin Peaks, which does this, I think, better than anybody, that very first I play clips in my music history classes sometimes. You watch that opening of Twin Peaks, the original series, and it's they're setting it up as a normal cop drama. Right. And then by the end of the episode or the next episode, they go into the red room and you're like, what is going on? Right. And so there's this stylized coloring. The lighting is weird. They have that wonderful effect where they speak backwards and play it forward, which just adds this uncanny level. All of those things following Porphyry are markers that there is an esoteric truth to be mined there. And so, so esotericism, I think, became a little bit of the hermeneutical key for digging through this stuff.
If I may ask a question then, with regard to the texts from the Corpus Hermeticum, where Hermes is talking to, if I'm remembering correctly, is Tot, and he's talking about the all of the stories that they're talking about. If you could take those teachings, and of course, in that period of time, there were also texts written down, and you talk about this as well, with vowel sounds that are supposed to be sung, and a particular pattern of these vowel sounds are supposed to be sung. Do you think then, because if I'm understanding you correctly, the sounds that were being sung during these rituals, they were not coinciding with the Platonic intervals that were centered around beauty, and what you were just giving the beautiful example of how these sounds were supposed to be played, the speculative music. So are you thinking then that these rituals that were being performed also had this weird quality to it?
Ooh, that's a great question. Well, okay, and I certainly can't offer a historical accurate answer.
Just your opinion.
Yeah. Okay. So, as I said at the beginning, everything I'm interested in requires an explanation before.
No problem.
All right. So, okay. So here, I think we've sketched out the situation. There's the speculative music, but there's this weird music. They're not supposed to coincide. How do they coincide? And one thing that really put me off of this was the idea that if you take harmonic ratios, they will give you a scale. They'll give you a tuning for a scale. There is no instruction that I'm aware of in any of the ancient sources where they tell you what to do with that scale. So when Plato talks about those ratios, he's thinking about Greek music that he understood. When a medieval person talks about those, they're thinking about medieval music. If an Islamic scholar in the Middle Ages, he's thinking about Islamic music from the era. And so there seems to be a tendency for people to assume that when you're talking about speculative music will be whatever kind of music that they think of as speculative, which is how we think about all music. I have a course to general education course to non-musicians. They say, what kind of music do you listen to? They say, well, all kinds. I listen to Taylor Swift and Metallica, right? But do you listen to, shakuhachi flute playing? Right? Yeah. There's a bit there. Okay. So one of the things that we will get back to your incantations. We are working back there. The thing that kind of really opened this up for me was stumbling upon a Neoplatonist, Iamblichus, or I guess Iamblichus is the Greek, and he wrote a text on the mysteries of the Egyptians, Chaldeans, and Assyrians, which is the title that was given to it later. And I thought, okay, this guy's talking about mysteries, so he must know something about what's going on. And he was the guy who really opened up the rest of the Neoplatonists for me. But in On the Mysteries, he is giving the philosophical defense for theurgy, which are these Neoplatonic ritual practices that are
supposed to elevate the soul to pure state. What you were talking about before.
Yeah. So they're talking about actually doing it. Now, one of the big things for Iamblichus is how he defines symbols are things that are material items, and they could be, plants, animals, metals, crystals, what have you, that are ontologically linked to a divine being or a divine energy. And so I'm reading about this, and I'm thinking of what I know about Vedic mantras from India. Mantras don't express the gods. They don't invoke the gods. Mantras are the gods. They are the same thing. And then I keep reading, and then he starts talking about what we often translate as Vocus Mysticae or Vocus Magicae, the barbarian names. They have a stunning array of titles, but these are essentially nonsense syllables. Nonsense syllables, so sounds that have no semantic meaning, but are often precisely, carefully arranged and transformed. Well, I'm thinking about Vedic mantras, and then I'm thinking about a sound that does not carry linguistic meaning, but is carefully patterned. That's a definition of music.
Yeah.
Music sounds that are patterned that don't carry any. I'm an advocate that music is not capable of carrying semantic meaning. That you can't. Okay, so if we think about a movie soundtrack, a composer can create up a sort of momentary system of representation, right? If you think of the Lord of the Rings movies, you have the woodwinds, pastoral woodwinds for the Shire, and the scary trombones for the orcs or whatever. So they're creating a system of semantic meaning, but it's only relative in that private moment. But music itself, there is no dictionary where you can say, well, this key equals this thing. Right. There are lots of competing systems of that. People try to make those correspondences, but it doesn't. I don't buy it. So music is fundamentally asemantic. However, because we understand how different musical systems work, what I think music does is it creates the impression of a meaning, but a meaning that we can never confirm. So music in any guise is actually pretty esoteric, right? If we think of Porphyry's weird symbols, they are things that suggest something to us. They activate our imagination. We start thinking past their literal image towards something that we can't quite get to, which is kind of what we experience when we feel even regular emotionally expressive music. You can't quite get to what that feeling is. So this just, this knocked my socks off when I got started getting
Right.
introduced.
Yeah. Yeah.
So my sense, I mean, back to your question is, okay, one thing I found interesting is everybody kind of assuming based on their particular music theory that their culture uses is kind of, and this idea of harmonic ratios was not something that Europe discovered by itself. I mean, the Chinese knew this, everybody knows, because it's just math and acoustics. So if you're paying attention, you can, and you're smart, you can work it out. I'm glad other people worked it out and told me, because I don't know if I would have. So okay, so that's the thing that exists, but there's not a lot of discussion about musical practice in conjunction with ritual either. You know, if you reading through, it doesn't matter modern to well, I think of, Joseph Campbell relates a lot of Native American stories. And when he relates them, they say, oh, well, this happened, they went here. And then they sang a song. And then the story picks up. And it's like, yeah, well,
What was the
what was
song?
the song? That's what I want to know. So, well, part of the problem is if you don't have a system of notating music and you don't have recording technology, then that's just lost. And even when we do, we have European notation, but some of that is, the musicologists have to fill that in because we don't know exactly.
Yes.
Anyway, so I don't know that we can say much about music in these contexts, but if you think about it, any ritual will take you out of your normal frame of reference. And this could be something, I don't know, some goofy, summer camp thing where they actually a good depiction is in the film Finding Nemo. If you remember, Nemo winds up in the in the fish tank, and the other fish take him through an initiation ritual, right? And it's done at night, and they have the volcano bubble thing. And it seems, well, I mean, Joseph Campbell again refers to ritual as things designed to take you out of your normal frame. So things are supposed to be different. You do rituals in special places. Maybe you wear special clothes. Maybe you do special lighting. Maybe you have incense burning, which is an underutilized way to, I mean, smell is a super powerful sense that we don't take into any account in our media. Concerts, movies, I guess theater could, but so you've got that going. Potentially you have a special language, right? Before Vatican II, you would do the Mass in Latin as another way to push you out of that normal frame of reference. So it seems to me that rituals are aided by making them different. And if we think about it, any concert is a type of ritual, right? You go into, maybe you wear nice clothes, you go into a room, you're going to sit very quietly, the lights will turn off. A special person who's wearing special clothes will get up and do something special, and you will be attentive to that. And, and just even a regular music concert, it's a moment to pause your normal activity. You're not worrying about the laundry piling up. You're not worried about getting the bills paid. You're just focusing on the music. That might be very somber if you go to a classical recital, but if you go to a rock and roll show, it may become this Dionysian, ecstatic, frenzied thing. And so you have, but
Especially
I think
with the drumming and stuff like that. That also,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
And, you could even extend that for some people going to sporting events, and you have that collective moment, and you are allowed to kind of go off the chain and be as crazy and as loud.
Chanting and
Yeah. And I think this is, people love to go to the dance club, because you have that intense environment. You have the communal environment. You've got lighting. You may or may not be mentally psychologically altered by substances. And in our mainstream culture, ritual is not really a part of it. So I think we have these alternative outlets. Mm-hmm. So I guess what I'm proposing is, well, and another way to think about ritual is the activation of symbols. And I think this is what Iamblichus is saying, is that you have these, if you're, if you've made correspondences between material items and in fact sounds with a certain divine energy, and you use those in an activity, whether the ritual is the activation of the symbols or the symbols charge the ritual. However, it's sort of the chicken and the egg at that point. But you're using activity with special items, right? Things that you've associated. Mm-hmm. However one wants to look at that, that's going to do something to you. All right. And we can probably all think through our lives, whether people have a ritual practice or contemplative practice, or they just did maybe some of those sporting initiations or summer camp special things they do. There are these moments where we mark off times for special things to happen. So part of what I'm trying to do, I guess, is figure out a way to create music that is symbolic. And then what do you do when you have a collection of pieces? You present them in a concert. So if you're, so I don't think I'm doing something so radical from traditional concert practice, but I think I'm just trying to lean in and emphasize that sort of ritual component.
Right. And you've actually, you've done this by composing music as an attempt to create a type of ritualistic repertoire, a theurgic repertoire. And you were very kind to share your work titled Oracle with me so that I can edit some of the music into this video when I'm producing it for upload, so that the viewers can actually hear what this music sounds like. So when listening to this, I don't get the sensation that this is just your everyday type of music. This is very, very different music. It kind of gave me the same type of reaction as when I listened to Rite of Spring or maybe Eric Satie, or music that most of us probably all know, Stravinsky and Satie, and we know these composers, and we know that they have these works, or maybe even like more of a, I consider the planets, Holst. Mm-hmm. If you listen to Neptune, with the voices at the end, and this kind of very otherworldly, almost sometimes eerie kind of evoking that comes up. But also what I found very interesting with your music is that when I would put it on and I would be like writing things, I was reading your work and I was writing notes and I was, making notations here and there and thinking about this, it kind of brought me into this state. I don't want to use words like trance, because it's almost kind of almost a cliche nowadays, talking about the trance, or people talk about getting into a flow, but it definitely brought me into a different mental state where I was very focused on what I was doing. And it was very different from other times when I would put other pieces of music on that, just the radio or whatever. So I personally felt a difference in the music. So I'm curious to know, it sounds like up until this point where we've been talking about how you're viewing this different music, this weird music, that there is supposed to be some kind of purpose for this music, so that it evokes a response in the person, putting them maybe in a liminal space, or a set apart space where something special is happening. And I'm wondering, what is your thinking process then about how this music works and how it should sound? What is the sound doing? because obviously it was doing something to me. So in your opinion, what is going on here? What is the sound doing in the composition, to the listener and also to you when you're performing it? And how, yeah, I'll stop there. I have tons of questions, but I'll just let you tackle that first.
Well, first, let me say that's very exciting for me to hear, because it's, we don't, in these kinds of fields, we don't always get a lot of a lot of feedback. We send our music into the world and hope for the best. So that's exciting for me to know that it had an impact. Okay, so there's a lot to
unpack here.
Well, okay, so one thing that was discouraging along the way, or if we go back to my initial encounter with the harmony spheres, how do I make that audible? What do I do? And harmonic ratios are nice, but okay, I've got some notes. Now what do I do with them? So one thing, coming across the Vocus Mysticae in Iamblichus, in this idea of these incantations, right? And you referred to some of them are just these open vowels, they're only vowels, and then some of them are these just almost unpronounceable clusters of consonants. They're just crazy stuff.
Genesis prote te semes genesios. Genesis prote te semes genesios. Genesis prote te semes genesios. Aeolu. Archetes semes arches prote. Pneumatos tu enemoi pneumatos proton.
But now one source we have for these is the Greek magical papyri, and so that's an actual. I think you've talked about it on the show before. That's an actual magic book from the late antiquity, written in Egypt but in the Greek language, and it tells you exactly how to cure your headache, win a chariot race, things like that. And then there's the Mithras liturgy, which is the most sort of speculative one, I think. But within these, you have just and there may be fragments of words from Hebrew or Egyptian and mixed together. It's not really clear. There's a lot of debate about that. The linguists are going to have to work that one out. But one of the things you can see in the Greek magical papyri is that, like some of these strings of vowels you've talked about, they'll do a thing where they write them all out, and then they repeat it and they drop one, and then they repeat it again and drop one. So you get these sort of triangular situations. You'll have things where you'll just chop a letter off, where you rotate the letters. Sometimes they're palindromes, which is so there's some careful syntax there. And again, that's the arrangement as a quality of music. And about the time I was discovering this, I also came across the work of Fritz Stahl, who was a Vedic scholar. He died in the late 90s, maybe. And he wrote a little provocative paper called Rules Without Meaning. And his thesis is that all ritual activity is meaningless. Now, he's writing from a very positivistic framework. So he says, this doesn't mean anything. All ritual is syntax. It's orderings of doing things. Later, people added symbolic content to it. So if we took a more familiar example, according to Stahl, something like the Eucharist would then has just have been choreographed eating and drinking that later picked up this association with Christianity. I don't know that I totally buy into the not totally meaningless structure of ritual, but that got me thinking about syntax, about ordering, about patterns a lot. And at the same time, another little synchronistic moment is I had given my 20th century music class, and they had an assignment. They had to write a piece that did not use any regular musical sounds. They couldn't use any regular musical notation. Oh. And so they came up with just all kinds of kooky stuff. And this one kid, he did this thing, and he went up to the table and he had a pad and a paper and a coin, and he would flip a coin and then he'd write something down. And he would flip a coin and write something down. And I was engrossed in this because I had just read Stahl's paper about meaningless ritual. And clearly he was following some rules that I didn't understand. And just the act of doing something as silly as flipping a coin and writing things down, when you perform it and you set aside time, this was his performance of his class project, you set aside time, you're all quiet, you're all focused, and he's doing this dumb stuff, but he's clearly doing it according to some set of rules. And I was like, whoa, this is something that's going on here between all this stuff. So if we've got these invocations from the ancients that are following these patterns, they don't mean anything. Well, the transformation of language units, that got me thinking about the Kabbalah. And one of the problems for me in researching the Kabbalah is everybody wants to talk about these sophisticated philosophical and theological notions. I didn't care about any of that. I do, but I wanted to get I wanted to learn more about techniques of word transformation. And so this took a little while to track down. And I don't quite understand if anybody's a specialist in Kabbalah. I'm open to guidance, but there are specific word techniques or patterns of transformation. The three main ones are notiricon, gematria, and temura. So notiricon is the idea that you can if you take a phrase, you can take the first letter and make an acronym, and so shorten it, or you can take a word and expand it out from an acronym. So that idea of filling out or contracting. Gematria is the famous number substitution. In Hebrew, you don't have independent characters for numbers, so you use letters, and that means words have numerical values. Well, now you can look for all kinds of symbolic meaning between words with the same numbers. And temura is, and I'm sure I pronounced everything wrong, but is the idea that you can rotate the alphabet, right? So if you were to write in English the first 13 letters and then turn around and put the last 13 letters, A would become Z and B would become Y and so forth. And so you can cross this up. So basically, all of this stuff mushed together that I should be thinking about syntax and patterning and transformation and, freely. One of the nice things about being a creative artist and not a historian is I'm allowed to do mashups. I did find one paper arguing for historical continuity between Iamblichus and Kabbalah, but that's just one. So I'm not claiming that there is, but in my imagination, they all went together. And so essentially the pieces that I sent you were written by adapting these Kabbalistic transformation patterns to music. So I would, and I also was encoding some of these ancient texts into it, either the Greek magical papyri, the Chaldean oracles are one that come up for the Neoplatonists a lot. And so I would just take these things, often working in the original Greek, and just assigning a short motive to a letter. And then I would kind of work out the motives in alphabetical order. And then as you arrange them according to the ancient text, all the motives get scrambled, and you get what you're writing is then revealed to you. So it was kind of a waiting on pins and needle to see what you would get. And then I would add some of these Kabbalistic transformations. Either I would rearrange the letters of the original text, which worked to some extent, but I needed more variation. So I started applying those to the actual musical motives. And so, for example, when I applied gematria, there is no, Hebrew has a long-standing assignment of numerical value to letter. Well, there isn't any standardized numerical value to pitch. So I simply made one up. And so then I would calculate the numerical value of the phrase, and then I would combine that with a rotation, maybe replace some of the pitches according to a different Kabbalistic procedure. And then the transform motive has a new numerical value. And so then I would have to add pitches to restore it to its original numerical value. So it was, within my personalized system, it was things matched up. Really what I was doing is a form of algorithmic composition, which people think of as maybe Milton Babbitt or Pierre Blaise. They write these elaborate pre-compositional edifices that tell you how to rules for churning out the piece. And essentially, once you set up these complicated procedures, you just calculate them, and it all is there for. So I was doing that. People often think of that as a very uncreative process. The creativity, I think, is in creating the rules for the transformations. You can tip the scales in whatever direction one wants by depending on what musical motives you put in at the beginning. And so, whereas some of the Milton Babbitt may be a little sterile sounding, I tried to put some of the special effects from my weird music into it to create the sound world that I like. But this idea that I didn't worry about how different, when I talk about a motive, I mean a really tiny sliver of music that would be just a blip on its own. So I didn't work them out. If you think of a Schubert melody, that's a carefully created whole. What I essentially did was made little musical Legos, right? Little independent pieces that I didn't know how they were going to fit together. And then following the rules, which we can think of as an algorithm, but according to Fritz Stahl, we can also think of as a ritual, because the ritual practice is just the rules of your activity. So I put these together, and made the transformations according to the rules. And so, which added another interpretive layer, because then as a performer, once I got this text that I didn't know, a score, I didn't really know what it was going to be until it was over. I had to figure out how to make musical sense out of it. And I may have pushed a note here or there, depending on what I thought worked better. Yeah, it was a really interesting, I started working on this at the time I was working on this. My wife was undergoing cancer treatment. And so, she was sleeping a lot, and I was just wanting to be home, and I wasn't going down to the basement to practice because I wanted to be nearby. And so I spent time crunching these numbers, with a notepad and working this stuff out. And I have to say, concentrating on this kind of stuff and playing these little, essentially number games, letter games, there was a strange kind of absorption in just working out the math for this stuff, which seemed to me to strongly suggest that Stahl is onto something, that just paying attention to patterns, not assigning any meaning to them, but just working with patterning, there's something going on there. And, in general, these pieces have been fairly well received, and it makes me think these Kabbalists, I think they knew something. They knew something about patternings and what that does to our psychology. I mean, you can decide how far you want to take it. But if you do, even though they're highly adapted and they're personalized, and I'm kind of making stuff up, the pattern is embedded in the musical process. Those patterns are happening as you listen. And even if you don't hear them, there are relationships there are Kabbalistic relationships unfolding in real time as you listen. And that, I think, it really makes me think something is going on.
Yeah. So in the research that you've done on this idea of ritual and initiatory experiences and the idea of the sacred and all of these things combined, and also with composing the music and working out all the numbers and sitting with that, and this whole process that you went through, what are your takeaways from this process? Is there, have you learned something? Have you come to any deeper insights as a musician, as a composer, or just philosophically thinking about how this sound is, how it's working, what it's doing?
Yeah. Boy, there's a lot in there. I mean,
I
I'm
tend
convinced.
not to ask easy questions. I'm sorry. I ask too many complicated things.
Well, and I think, and that kind of gets us to one of the points. If you ask me what was on my shopping list for later this afternoon, I could tell you exactly, and who would care? And there's something, this idea that the weird, the enigmatic, the strange, even the disturbing. I mean, that's a theme. That's the nature of symbolism, and that keeps coming back in all kinds of mythologies and esoteric systems and apophatic mysticism. It's all over. It seems to be a recurring theme with people who have thought about this stuff. And I have said to my students, to their frustration, that music is the enemy of sound. And what I mean by that is, okay, so if we think about language, right now you're hearing me think out loud about sound, and you're putting the sounds together faster than you can even imagine to get past the sound to the linguistic content of what I'm saying. And when we know what something means, we tend not to hear it. You're hearing ideas, you're hearing sentences. We're not hearing the sonic qualities, the distinction between different types of consonances, between consonants and vowels. Not really mindful of how I'm using pacing to make certain things, certain points. Had the rhythm of the music. We take all that for granted. Maybe you're doing some emotional coding based on my inflection and so on and so forth, but we're not really listening. And I think the same thing happens in music. When we hear a tune, we tend to hear something like a statement, like a sentence. And if it's a tune we recognize, think of your favorite pop song. We spend less time listening to the timbre, to just the pure sound of things. And one of the things I like in weird music, depending on which type of weird music, is that there's a much greater focus on sound. I'm thinking of people like Pauline Oliveros and her deep listening sound practice, which is just about exactly what it sounds like, listening. Giacinto Scelsi, who wrote his famous 4 pieces for orchestra on a single note, because he wanted to simplify the pitch content so that you listen to the ever-shifting qualities of a single sound. And he was way into all this kind of speculative stuff also. And I think in order to get to that point where we're hearing sounds, there's this sort of deconstruction of meaning that has to happen, analogous to what we've been talking about with some of these invocations. So I think some of that is happening. And then I think as you combine those sounds into maybe more complex structures, when they're unfamiliar, they sort of force you, well, again, out of your regular modes. I've come up with an idea I call the hermeneutical leap. And it's the idea, kind of building on Porphyry's, that when you're confronted with something that you can't make sense out of, you have to struggle a little bit to come up with some kind of way of reconciling yourself with this. And if all of this is related to the sacred, or the transcendent, however one wants to care for it. Another takeaway from Joseph Campbell I took is the idea that all of this stuff is beyond names and forms, right? He takes this from the Sanskrit Namarupa. It's not, and this comes up with apophatic writers like, well, Plotinus, or one of my favorites, Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite. And he's saying, you can't, Plotinus says, we call it the one. But even to name it the one is inappropriate because it's beyond all understanding. It's beyond all conception. And I think one thing that happens is as we cling to that sort of the harmonic ratios and that glorious ascent to Apollo, we're making that evaluation based on music that makes sense to us, which is the opposite of apophaticism. And Pseudo-Dionysius comes back, and if you're going to say God is light, that's fine, but you also say God is not light. You have to negate that image. And there creates this hermeneutical conflict. You start getting in a word loop. You have to affirm it, but then you negate it, but then you have to negate the negation. So is that an affirmation? Well, we're going to affirm the negation of the affirmation just to negate it. And I think when we listen to music that's familiar to us, none of that is happening. Right? If I teach Mozart in a class, nobody wonders why I'm teaching Mozart. Oh, of course, we all do Mozart. I'm only affirming everything we already know. But when I bring in some strange stuff, and the kids are having their first experience with it, you're like, "What are you doing? Why are you playing? That's not music." Well, what do you mean by music, right? And so then we're into we have the opening to do a lot of different kinds of reflections. But so if this is somehow any of this music that I'm trying to make is symbolic of the transcendent, the regular rules of reasoning don't apply. And you had Wouter Hanegraaff a while back talking about his new book on the Hermetica, and he was talking a lot about nous, and this you translate it as intellect, but we're not talking. It's not about regular scientific positivistic. It is a super rational mode of knowing, and that's ultimately, I guess, where I'm trying to push. I'm trying to create a hermeneutical crisis in the listener, along with a sort of set and setting through the concert, to allow the imagination to kick in. It's like, what is this? What is happening here? Well, Iamblichus might say you sing these incantations and that brings in whichever deity. And there are systems around the world that do that. I think, the Tarantella, where the spider bite in southern Italy in olden days, have to find the right tune for which spider inflicted. So there are these correspondences, but those are localized and conditional. And depending, people in those traditions, they should pursue those traditions, but I don't think those of us out of those traditions need to become bound to them. So is there some ontological linking? Is it a spiritual transformation? Is it a psychological transformation? One of the things working on this project has come to me is I don't really know what the difference between a meaningful psychological experience versus a meaningful spiritual experience. I don't know what the difference is between those. We assume there's a difference, but I'm not so sure. And I think it was Antoine Favre who, in his sketch or his outline of esotericism, talks about one of the qualities that makes something esoteric is the mediation of the imagination. Yeah. Okay, so what do you mean about imagination? Is that just the mental faculty where the neurons make stuff up, or is it more like an Henri Corbin is literally looking at Sufi mystical texts and saying the imagination is where the angels interface with us? I don't know. But there's something that happens, I think. I mean, looking at it as the mediation of the imagination, I don't know if we need to define that. Something happens inside us, I think, when we put ourselves in the right environments or we read the right text.
I think so too. And Henri Corbin also talks about imagination as the organ of perception. It's a ontological state that he's talking about. There's in between the physical and the spiritual. There's this imaginal state, and this is our faculty to perceive. And this is not just mere figments of fantasy that's coming up and like daydreaming or something that might be just are you thinking when your mind kind of wanders a little bit, when you're listening to a long lecture and you're thinking about, oh yeah, what do I need to pick up from the grocery store later? Those types of things. It's different. It's very, and I think personally, I think I had this tiny little glimpse of that faculty of perception with that focus that I had when I was listening to your music. And it really made a deep impression on me.
To come back to that point, one writer I've drawn on a lot is David Lewis Williams. And he's not an esotericist at all. He's an anthropologist, archaeology guy. And his book is The Mind in the Cave. And he is interested in the origins of Paleolithic cave paintings.
Okay.
And he's South African, and so the sand of the Kalahari in olden times had a tradition of rock painting, and so he did a lot of study of that sort of thing. But his conclusion, to spoiler alert, is that he thinks essentially our ancestors were going into these caves and doing shamanic type rituals, entering altered states of consciousness, and then recording those visions on the cave wall, sort of intensifying the location. It's the place where experience took place, but then also through the paintings, it intensifies for the next group to come do that. But he's a scientist. He's not. He's really into neurology and brain chemistry, and so. But this, which I think is really interesting, is by looking at the science. He talks about the idea that the brain naturally goes through on a predictable schedule these different levels of inward and outward, right? We have this hyperfocus, alert rationality is the term he uses. And then we move into these sort of daydreamy things. And there's sometimes we're controlling the action in our daydreams, and then later the daydream kind of controls the action. We kind of just float through that. And then his argument is that we shouldn't use the phrase altered states of consciousness because it suggests there's a normal state of consciousness. It says your brain is designed to go through all this stuff. He also concludes that your brain is designed to go into a full-blown trance, that is a normal, healthy part of healthy brain activity. And so then, as a not at all mystical guy, he then takes our sort of Western culture to task by saying we have lionized alert, rational consciousness and assume that that's the best, when that is not what's supported by the brain research. Wow. And other cultures who are practicing trance, and the research is like something like 94% of the world's cultures practice some form of institutionalized trance. We're the outliers. We have not embraced the full spectrum of human consciousness. And so that there's more going on here. And this is from a guy who's a complete materialist, rationalist dude, just by looking at the science. And I love these places where the science and the traditions start to come together. But there's an ethnomusicologist, Judith Becker, and she has a book called Deep Listeners. And essentially one of the arguments she makes, she's looking at music and trance through different cultures. And her conclusion is that people have this really profound experience listening to music. And I think everybody has had some experience with that.
Yeah.
That what's happening is essentially a mini kind of trance, that your brain is moving into these other regions. Like you had first said when you brought this up, well, I don't want to say I had a full on trance. Well, no, but in the terms of David Lewis Williams, you were moving across a spectrum of consciousness away from alert rationality towards a more trance-like state. And so I think in this whole idea of engaging the imagination, it's just ways of moving on that spectrum. Or, Lewis Williams concludes you have to do some sort of special things to trip it into tripping. like a lot of dancing or a lot of maybe meditating in a dark cave, or there's if you remove external stimulation
Yeah.
after 4 hours, the brain will start to fill it in
Hmm.
for itself. And so one of the things he says is, well, how do cultures incorporate that? Is it the gods talking to you, or is it just you understand that your brain is doing stuff, or do we sort of vilify it, as I think is the underlying tone in sort of industrialized cultures? So I think I think all kinds of music can do that, but I don't know. I think weird music, for some of the esoteric symbolic reasons we've discussed, is maybe a little better
Yeah.
at doing that.
I think I would agree with you on that point. And I think we'll have to leave it there. I mean, I feel like we've just touched, the very, very surface of all this, to scratch the surface of all of this. But I mean, fascinating, fascinating, interesting stuff that you're talking about. Thank you so much for sharing all of this. And thank you for sharing your music. Wonderfully engaging music. And I'm really looking forward to editing the music into the video so that everyone can hear it as well. And of course, I'll put the links to the places where they can hear the whole album. Of course, I was wondering if people want to contact you, or if they just want to follow what it is that you're doing. How can they find you online?
My website is randallhall.net. Simply, I don't do a lot I have a Facebook account. I think it's still.
You do. I found you.
All right. So it's there. So my website is the best, I
Okay.
think. And then my Bandcamp site,
Okay.
which is linked from my website. That's
Right. Right.
where a lot of music can be heard.
Okay. Excellent. I will be sure to include that in the program notes necessary. All the links in the description box. If anyone has questions, please put them down in the comment section below. Good luck with your book, Randall. I look forward to reading it once it's published. And I wish you very happy holidays. And thanks again for taking the time to talk with me today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you so much. Okay, that's all for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you all again soon. Bye-bye.